Hi everyone, welcome to M365 UK, Microsoft 365 UK user group. A big welcome to every one of you, including the guests outside of the UK. This is our 13th edition, and in fact, it's our first anniversary, if you like, because it was almost exactly a year ago when M365 UK was created, and so since then, been bringing all these sessions across to yourselves. So welcome once again to everyone for being here today. We have some great sessions today with the likes of Neil McLoughlin and also Anoop Tatti. And so we have sessions covering the now, which is rebranded the Windows Virtual Desktop. So Neil McLoughlin will be presenting around the best practices, the hints and tips, as well as the teams on those desktop workloads really. So we'll catch up with Neil very shortly, just kind of get through the intros, but also we'll take a 10-minute break, and especially where I'm at today in London, especially it's very hot and humid, so definitely need a bit of a break to kind of just get water and stretch legs and so forth. But after the break, 5:10 or thereabouts, we have a session from Anoop Tatti, which is going to be covering sessions around the options for obtaining the access tokens, working with Microsoft Graph, which is essentially the data layer of Microsoft 365 and services, being able to kind of interact through all the Azure applications and other types. So two great sessions, slightly different topics, if you like. So there's obviously something in it for everybody, and I'm really looking forward to both of those sessions. For those of you who are not aware, I'm Chirag Patel. I live and work in London, and generally work as a Microsoft 365 consultant, delivering collaboration and productivity solutions, covering workloads around SharePoint, Microsoft Teams, Yammer, and Power Platform. But I also work in various capacity as an architect, trainer, engineer, doing migrations, deployments, and been doing this for about 20 odd years now. And also try and keep up to date with some of the certifications and the changing landscape of Microsoft 365, but also awarded Microsoft MVP for basically my contributions towards speaking at various community events, but also being able to organize events such as these. So feel free to reach out to me on techchirag.com, and all my slides, everything else, all the information about M365 UK, you'll find it's on the techchirag.com. For just for those of you who are new to the M365 UK, we have a session planned next month, which is on the 14th of July. And we got, again, 3 great speakers there from the UK. So you got Joel Rodriguez, you got Zoe Wilson, as well as Luke Evans as well. So we got sessions there around the security connecting to SharePoint from Azure functions, as well as some of the best practices around the usability and versus security with Microsoft Teams. So if you haven't already, then please head over to meetup.com/M365UK, and you can register for free there as well. So hopefully you can join us next month. All the slides and the recordings will be made available hopefully by this Friday. And so we have a Twitter, LinkedIn pages as well. So M365 UK is the Twitter handle. And so feel free to connect through that and subscribe, and also the M365 UK YouTube channel as well. So you can actually subscribe to some of the past sessions as well. So hopefully that will be kind of, that'll work for you. But also, just like Neil and Anoop, who submitted their sessions, I'm always looking out for new and variety of topics, of course, relating around Microsoft 365. So if you feel like you can, you can present, share, it doesn't have to be a full hour or 50 minutes. It can be half an hour if you like. Then feel free to QR code scan from your device, and just a couple of questions, just given your session title. And if you're new to the speaking, then I'd love to help you out. So don't be afraid, and just do it, really. So it'll be really great to have you speak with us at M365 UK. So with that in mind, it's basically kind of gives me a pleasure to welcome Neil McLoughlin, who's going to be talking to us about the best practices for using Microsoft 365. And up until last week, Azure Virtual Desktop, as it's now called, got rebranded. Essentially, Microsoft trying to broaden the outline around the manageability and security, and also bring in some new capabilities. So probably, it's a great time to see some of the developments in the virtual desktop infrastructure environments. But Neil has been in IT for over 20 odd years now, worked with various capacity as a consultant, engineer with third-party virtual desktop infrastructures, and it's he runs a community and also a user group, UK Azure, which I believe is renamed recently, so I'll let him and speak about that. But yeah, it's great to have Neil, and welcome, Neil, to be with at M365 UK. So when you're ready, over to you.
Thank you very much, Chirag. I'm just going to share my screen and then we'll get going. I appreciate it's a very sunny afternoon, so kudos to everyone for attending this event. It's a great event, so thanks for everyone. So yeah, essentially what I'm going to present on today is some best practices essentially for deploying M365 services on Azure Virtual Desktop, because I've done a few deployments and I've seen quite a few things people do things wrong. So just put something together. We're not going to go deep technical. It's very sort of high level overview covering all the stuff like Teams and SharePoint and that kind of stuff. Okay, so as Chirag just mentioned, see the slide which says Microsoft Windows Virtual Desktop. As of today, that doesn't exist. It's now been renamed as Azure Virtual Desktop, essentially to align to what Microsoft see as the future. It is now kind of an Azure first-class citizen. So if you've never heard of it before, hopefully by the end of this session, you'll have a bit better overview of what it is, and essentially how to sort of deploy your existing M365 services onto that, so your users can have the best experience essentially. So a bit about myself. So yeah, I've been around for a while. I've been over 20 years in IT now, so it makes me feel really old. My current job, I work for a company called Nerdio as their UK field CTO. So we specialise in Azure Virtual Desktop deployment. So we have a sort of management plane which we plug in on top of Azure Virtual Desktop. So yeah, I'm even struggling to say it now. So which makes it basically easier to manage, and we also do really advanced auto scaling engine. So I'm also co-founder of the Azure Virtual Desktop community, which used to be called the Windows Virtual Desktop community. That's something I set up over 18 months ago now. So we've got lots and lots of members to that. So we run user groups throughout the world. So sort of France, Germany, America, Holland, so you name it. We've got, I think we've got over 15 local user groups in the moment. And also the co-founder of the UK Windows Virtual Desktop user group. Okay, so that's what I host monthly, so similar to this event, but obviously which is focused on the sort of Azure Virtual Desktop product. Also a Microsoft MVP, which I was awarded last year. So due to sort of all the stuff that I've been doing with the community for the past sort of 18 months to 2 years. You can find me on Twitter at VirtualMank or on the WD community, which again we need to rename. Also, I've got a personal website, VirtualMank, and also the WDcommunity.com, which is where I post all my I do a weekly newsletter around sort of Azure Virtual Desktop stuff. That's my LinkedIn profile as well. And if you want to drop me an email, if you want to know more about me or want to chat about anything related to Azure Virtual Desktop, please feel free to drop me a mail. So let's get going. So what we're going to cover today, so we're basically going to give a very high level overview of Azure Virtual Desktop. We're going to talk about licensing. We're going to be using how best to deploy your 365 apps onto the Azure Virtual Desktop image, because image management is very important. Then we're going to delve into some Microsoft Endpoint Manager integration, which was only released about 2 weeks ago into public preview. And then we're going to talk about best managed teams on Azure Virtual Desktop. Anyone who's deployed Teams in a VDI environment knows how challenging it can be. So I'm going to give you some tips how best to do that. And then we're going to talk about how to manage sort of OneDrive, and also within that OneDrive, also manage sort of Teams, OneDrive, and SharePoint cache as well, using what we call FS Logics, which is a profile management solution, which we'll go into detail as well. So lots to cover. So you'll probably find me talking quite fast. If you've got any questions, just pop them in the chat window, and I'll try and answer them after the session, or if we don't have time, I can answer the questions offline as well. Okay, let's get going. So a bit of introduction to essentially what is Azure Virtual Desktop. I appreciate there'll be probably some people on this presentation who may have never even heard of this. So sort of VDI used to be sort of quite a niche industry. Obviously, it's got a lot popular due to this sort of the pandemic. A lot of people are now using it to sort of work from home capabilities, stuff like that. So Azure Virtual Desktop used to be called RDMI, and then it got renamed when it was released to Windows Virtual Desktop in September 2019. And then it's been progressively getting better and better and better since that. In June 2021, Microsoft renamed it to Windows Virtual Desktop. It's like to Azure Virtual Desktop. See, I keep on getting it wrong. So just to confuse people even further, but hopefully they won't change it again. So what makes it different? So essentially, you can only run Windows 10 multi-session in Azure. So that's what people use to connect to it. So over the next slide, I'll go into a bit more detail about that. But Windows 10 multi-session is essentially a special operating system which allows multiple users to log on to use it to run their applications or run full desktops or whatever they want to do. Okay, so. And that is Azure only. So you can't run Windows multi-session in like AWS or Google Cloud or anything like that. It's purely an Azure only operating system. Okay, you can technically do it. Some people have done it, but it's not right. You're not licensed to do so. So I wouldn't advise it. But yeah, it's at the moment it's Azure only. And essentially within the VDI world, it's kind of replaced like the Windows Server operating systems. And previously, if you wanted to use what we call multi-session, as in lots of people connecting to the same operating system or applications, you'd have to use a Windows Server operating system, whether that's 2012, 2016, or 2019. And then what they call the RDSH role, which is the remote desktop session host, and then use that to sort of push your applications, desktops out to your users. So essentially, what we tend to see is using Windows Virtual or Azure Virtual Desktop. You probably, I'd say, probably a good 80 to 90% use Windows 10 multi-session, and then the legacy people may use like Windows Server if they've got any applications which require them as well. Okay, so again, why choose Windows 10 multi-session over your Windows Server? Well, it's cheaper because you don't need to use the RDS CALs, so it's cheaper to deploy, and also you don't need a licensing server, so that saves you some infrastructure costs as well. And as of the 14th of January, Microsoft 365 apps is not actually supported on Server 2012 R2. So I know there's still a lot legacy 2012 R2 environments out there, but just so you know, it's not supported. So that's another reason to move over to sort of Windows 10 multi-session if you can. And another big thing is the Microsoft application compatibility. So running sort of desktop applications on servers can sometimes be a bit problematic. That's why we have like wonderful application packages who like do shimming and other fancy techniques to get stuff to work. If everything's running Windows 10, we don't need that anymore because most applications are just going to work on a Windows 10 operating system. And we also have full support what they call MSX App Attach, which is the latest sort of application virtualization technology, which is eventually going to replace what they call AppV. And that is also MSIX is also going to be a replacement for MSIs as well. But uptake's going to be slow, but I'm not going to do this about this presentation because we'll be here all night. And the most important thing as well is more consistent user experience. With a Windows Server, you used to be able to essentially have a desktop experience, but it wasn't quite the same. If we use Windows 10 multi-session, when a user logs onto it, they get exactly the same user experience as they would do on any other normal Windows 10 desktop. So the users find that much easier to use and reduce attack service as well. Obviously, we're not running a server operating system. We don't have stuff running which shouldn't be running. So it's better from a security perspective as well. And so Windows or Azure Virtual Desktop, that's essentially what it is from a high level overview. One of the bases of it is Azure Active Directory, so you need Azure AD to deploy it, and then essentially you have a sort of control plane, So at the top here, so this here is the control plane which the Microsoft control for you, so you don't need to do anything from that, and that's all done for you from a Microsoft perspective. So support-wise, everything all done by Microsoft within their own data centers. Again, I'm not going to go into much detail about that because we'll be here all night. And essentially what most people do is you connect it up to Azure AD. You need to basically plug into your existing environment. So you can either run Azure Active Directory Domain Services or a normal domain controller, and connect up and set up Azure AD Connect to sync your users that you can use for the Azure Virtual Desktop deployment. Because identity-wise, it needs two things. It needs a Azure AD for the user authentication, and then it needs the normal Active Directory for the to add in the host to the domain. Okay, but that's all going away soon. But at the end of the year, Microsoft are actually going to be releasing the native Azure AD integration, so we can add our hosts straight into Azure AD. And that will give us things like single sign-on capability, assign permissions directly to our Azure AD accounts, and so that'll be a big step to make this solution really great. So that's a typical architecture deployment that you'd see. You'd have like a sort of VNet in your environment, and you'd have like an via express route or a sort of VPN site-to-site gateway, which connects your on-prem environment into the Azure environment, which contains all the Azure Virtual Desktop components which your users connect to. Okay, so that's a very high level overview, and obviously we have on the right as well, we have Azure files or Azure NetApp files, and that can be held to use your users, either your sort of normal file shares or most commonly used to use the profile solution, which we'll go into a bit more detail as well. And connection wise, there's a remote desktop client which the users use to connect to the environment. It also has a sort of a web client as well, which you can use, but yeah, most clients are supported. So you can connect to it from Linux, Mac OS, all the most popular stuff. Operating stuff, as we said before, we can create a sort of image that we need to use for the users to connect to. So that can either be, as we mentioned, Windows Server, or most commonly the Windows 10. When you go to create that image, when you build your master image, you can select which version you want. So 9 out of 10, you're going to pick up the most recent version. And we'll go into a bit more detail about what more choices you need to make around that soon. And for those who are a bit security conscious, we have Gen 1 versus Gen 2. So Gen 1 is these sort of legacy type VMs, and Gen 2 is the VMs with the UEFI BIOS in them. And so they're obviously based in, you can't get those in all locations in Azure, so check when you're deploying them if they're available. But if they are, I suggest you use them, because you can take advantage of like secure boot and sort of TPM chips and virtualization based security and Windows Defender Credentials Guard as well, on all that stuff to protect all your sort of Azure Virtual Desktop hosts. So have a look at that link there that I've put in, and how to sort of deploy and manage those as well. Okay, so wonderful licensing. So what a lot of people don't realize is if you have a existing 365 license, you can already use this solution. Okay, so if you have a E5 or E3 or E5 license, which most people do, you're licensed to use Azure Virtual Desktop. So unlike the likes of like Citrix or VMware, you need to license separately. This all comes part of your solution. Okay, so it can be a bit cheaper for you to run, so no extra licensing required. So that's a very good thing. So that's just why during the pandemic we saw humongous growth with Azure Virtual Desktop, because people can just go and deploy it, and they don't have to like go to the account director and say, please can you give me like £500,000 for licenses, because we've already paid for 365 license, therefore we don't need to pay anything further. So one of the key things which we need to think about when we're deploying Azure Virtual Desktop is the image management. It's something which sometimes people don't spend much time on. They just deploy it and say they forget it. That's not what you want to do. You want to probably spend most of your time trying to get the image right, because it's one of the most common things which I see out there is people not doing image management properly. Okay, so you want to make sure you get your image as clean as possible, and also make sure it's as little as possible in that OS, which can cause any sort of performance issues. So Number one tip, disable all your updates in there. So you certainly don't want all your applications starting to update themselves when there's like 10 people logged onto the host. You certainly don't want your OS to start patching itself when there's like 15 people logged onto the host. So disable all the updates and manage everything within your images. Okay, so spend a bit of time looking at what your applications are doing, look at the services, look at the registry keys and see if there's any update scheduled, look in the scheduled tasks, all that kind of stuff. And there's also a optimization tool which Microsoft produced, which is the virtual sort of desktop optimization tool, and that's a PowerShell script which you run on the operating system. So you can run that on your master image, and that'll basically disable everything that's unnecessary, and that can save you quite a bit of sort of time and bandwidth as well. And if you can do all your management via the image, and then redeploy that image to all your host pools once a month, so you're getting clean images all the time. I see a lot of people who basically deploy images and then just patch them every month and never update them. It's not a great way. Just keep it as clean as you can. If you can, maybe script it and use something like Nerdio or use sort of DevOps or anything like that to deploy them. But if you redeploy your hosts every month, you're going to have clean ones. You're going to have clean OS images, and all those pesky help desk problems will kind of hopefully go away. So you mentioned the optimization script. What does it do? Basically removes all the Apex packages that you have. So stuff like your Xbox, your phone, your music. You don't need those on a VDI image. So to increase performance, because Apex packages are actually, every time the users log on to the host and they sort of referenced, and they can really slow down these sort of log on times. So it removes all those. It removes all unnecessary scheduled tasks, and also removes unnecessary services. I'm not going to go into that every single one of them because again we'll be here all night. But there's the link that I put earlier. Go to the GitHub site. You can have a look and see what's on there as well. So one of the key things to think about if you're new to sort of VDI world and sort of Azure Virtual Desktop is what kind of host pools do we have? Well, we have two. We have a personal host pool, which is a one-to-one mapping of the user. So that's what we would traditionally have if you like developers or people who need a lot of CPU power. They're given one VM, and that VM is their VM to use in Azure. Okay, so we can treat that as a normal desktop normally, and we don't need to do all the stuff that I just mentioned. You can just have it and the user has it as their only normal desktop. Okay. And then we also have what we call our pooled desktops. Okay, so these are ones that multiple users will log on to, right? So you could have like 5 people, 10 people, 15 people, depending on the size of the VM. Okay, so this is what makes sort of Windows 10 multi-session different from any other version of Windows 10, because I can now have 20 people log on to my Windows 10 host, one host. So if you think about it, if you had 10 of those, you could have 100 people, for example. So rather than deploying 100 single VMs, you just deploy 10 VMs and have 10 people log on to that VM, which obviously is a lot cheaper than deploying 100 VMs. So that's essentially what Windows 10 multi-session is. So key thing about these sort of 365 apps, when you deploy your image, you get the option to deploy it with Office or without. If you can, pick without, because as we'll shortly see, we can control what we want in that sort of application deployment. Okay, and that makes the best perform better for your users, and they get a nicer experience as well. And you'll see why over the next few slides. So when we're deploying it, we can use the Office deployment toolkit to basically pick how we want to deploy it. So we can use the customizations, which is going to basically spit out an XML file, which will go, I'll do a quick demo in a minute. But the ones that you want to turn off are OneDrive, you want to turn off Skype for Business, and you want to turn off Teams. The reason why we're doing that will become clear in a minute, because there's specific special versions that we need to deploy onto our desktop to make it perform better in a VDI environment. I don't know if any of you used it before, so what I'll do, I'll just basically pre-recorded this video just to go through it, and this will basically show you what you need to do. So you go to the Office customization tool, then we can just pick what we need to pick, select the product, and then go down, and then we select our channel. So I mean, you probably most people pick semi-annual enterprise channel for VDI environments, because it's better for application compatibility, because you've got multiple people logging onto that desktop, you can get issues with like plugins and stuff like that. So people just prefer to do the multi-channel one, which means that they won't get as many updates and therefore less problems in theory. So obviously now we can pick the sort of language that we're going to deploy, select the installation, so where we're going to get it from, so download it straight from the CDN, and then obviously we want to make sure that it isn't automatically updated as well. So we want to control the update when we do the master image update. Okay, so again, we don't want sort of Office updating itself when there's lots of people on there. And this is quite key. We want to enable shared computer activation. I'll go through that at the next slides in a bit more detail, but this will sort of take away all your licensing problems. Okay, so once we've done that, we can just finish off. We've done everything, so click on finish. We just check what we've deployed and check we've got the correct excluded applications in there. Make sure you got your settings right, and then basically once you've done that, just click on export, which is going to spit out that XML file, and then we use that XML file to do the installation onto our image. Okay, and that's the image that we're going to create our host from. Okay, so we're using one image to create all our hosts rather than just deploying sort of separate Windows installations. It's all going to be from that one central image. Okay, so you just click that, and then we click on export, and then if everything's working correctly, it will pop out a XML file, which you then take that, run the Office deployment with, and then just point it to the XML file. Okay, and that's it. So if you're using like DevOps and scripting, you can just stick this into your sort of DevOps pipeline and have that sort of when you do your image creation as well. Okay, so which takes us to our first sort of feature of the Office. So now we've got an image, we've installed Office onto it, it's not auto updating itself, and we deployed what we need to deploy. So why did we remove OneDrive? We removed OneDrive because essentially OneDrive needs a specific version on VDI environments. We install that by using OneDrive setup.exe/all users. The reason why is because when you deploy OneDrive natively, it installs itself into the user's profile, right? So we don't want that because that will mean that every time it logs onto a new server, it's going to reinstall OneDrive into the user profile, which is not good. And it takes up lots of CPU usage and causes problems syncing and lots of badness. So essentially, all we have to do is deploy it into all users, and that will essentially deploy it and install it into the C program files directory, and then you won't get any more problems, hopefully. So recommended GPO settings to make it work better in your environment. So allow syncing from only your own organization to stop people adding stuff in there. The reason why you did that will become clear in the next couple of slides. Block file downloads when used alone disk space, exclude specific kinds of files for being uploaded. So obviously you don't want the likes of sort of movie files and MP3s and stuff because again, space is at a premium, as we'll discuss in the next few slides. And also use OneDrive files on demand, and that's probably my number one tip. Because obviously it's enabled out of the box by default, but we need to make sure we enforce it just in case somebody changes it, because that could cause big problems when it comes to sort of the FS Logics profile, which I touched upon shortly and we'll discuss over the next few slides. So OneDrive on demand sync, I said it'll only download what you need rather than download a whole lot. If someone's got like 10 gig OneDrive files, that means that every time they log on to a sort of Azure virtual desktop, it's going to download 10 gigs worth of files into their FS Logics user profile, which could cause problems because normally we have a limit of around 10 gig or of around 30 gig depending on your configuration. But enable this out by GPO or by Intune, or you can even set it in the actual image itself, just to be 100% safe that nothing's going to change that setting. So huge tip there, make sure you do that in your environment, otherwise you could run into lots of problems. I touched upon this before, but shared computer activation, make sure you do that for your sort of Office installation. By default, you get 5 activations per user, which if you log in onto a fresh host pool every day or a fresh host, that's going to run out very quickly. To set this, you can edit the installation XML file to share computer licensing to 1, or deploy it via group policy, or again via sort of Intune as well. But yeah, definitely do that, otherwise you will have licensing problems as well in your environment, and you'll find yourself constantly sort of going into users and taking back all the licenses, so not good. So how does that work? So essentially what happens is a user logs onto the desktop, Azure Virtual Desktop, and so you may have like 5 users logging onto the same desktop. The user launches the O365 application, and then basically what happens is, as usual, it goes off to get the token from the Office licensing service, and then the licensing token is then stored into the user's profile. Now, obviously, normally, if I'm logged onto a local machine, my profile is local, then that's going to stay there. Okay, if I then log onto another machine, it's going to activate it again, and that's fine as long as you don't log onto more than 5 workstations. So that's only valid for 30 days, and then obviously when it comes, I think it's halfway through, it gets renewed. And if you want to have a look, you can see that in the local updater licensing directory, which I put there. So starting with Microsoft Apps version 365 version 17.04, we can actually roam it with the user profile. As I mentioned before, if you look at that, it's the local app data. So sometimes some profile solutions don't roam that. We want to move it into app data. Okay, so that means that's going to follow me around. So that means if I log on to another host, then that essentially I won't have to go through that whole sort of activation again because it's already activated. So it's just going to read what's in that directory and it says, yep, Joe Blogs, he's already activated, he's already licensed, he's good to go. Let's launch it. Okay, so that happens for each user who logs on to that host. So yeah, that's how that one works. So I've just done a quick demonstration here. So essentially, so you can see what it looks like. So I've set the policy setting. So as you can see, it's created that directory. So I'm just going to log in. And here you're going to see my really bad spelling of how not to type when you're trying to log in. It's always when someone's watching. Okay, enter the password. And at this stage, this is when it goes off to the licensing server to get its token. So we'll just double check it's activated. So yep, I'm not getting any message saying it's not activated. And go to the account, check everything's okay. As you can see, the product will not be updated because we turned that off when we did the XML creation. And that's what is in that directory. So you'll see this is the license token essentially. And that's just information about the certificate and stuff like that. So obviously it's encrypted. So that's what's helped there. So if you've got any licensing activation problems, just have a look in there and make sure this file's been put in there as a troubleshooting step. Okay, so the next one you've probably heard me mention it a few times now is FS Logics. So FS Logics is the profile management solution that is used by Azure Virtual Desktop. It used to be a third-party product, and then Microsoft bought it back in, I think it was 2019 or maybe in 2018, I can't remember. But essentially what this does, it creates a write filter, read-write filter, which basically redirects everything which you write as part of your profile into a VHD file, which is stored on a Azure file share, or it can be an on-prem file share, or it can be a NetApp file share as well. So essentially what that means is when you log on to a separate host pool, your VHD file is going to be attached upon login, and your profile will be loaded off that. Okay. And this is really important for user experience because obviously this contains all the information regarding your sort of OneDrive, Teams, or your Outlook. It can hold your search index for your Outlook and all that kind of stuff. So very, very important to get this right. And we'll go over that in a bit more detail in the next few slides. Okay, so as I mentioned before, it's installed by default. That only happened very, very recently, as in within the past month or so. So before that, you had to go and install it manually, but you still obviously need to make sure that you're up to date to the latest version because it does I think probably around every 3 months they update it. So keep an eye on that link to see if there are any new updates to it because there are a few quirky problems that you get with it, especially with sort of integration. I've seen over the past few days people moaning about sort of SharePoint corruption and stuff like that. So you need to be a bit careful and obviously test it as well. So as I touched upon, you need a file share to use it with, and this can be a Windows file server if you're doing it sort of within Azure or on-prem. You can use Azure Files, which is normally the recommended way to go. Or if you've got a really big deployment, I recommend NetApp Azure Files as well if you need that really good performance. It's not too expensive to set up an Azure file share, so for 100 gig, you're probably looking around £13 a month, or for a 1 terabyte, you're probably around £130 a month. But obviously it depends how many users and the size of the profiles and all that kind of stuff. So as per usual, make sure you size it, make sure you test it, and to get the required sort of performance you need. Use Azure Files Premium if you can for that Azure file share, because that gives you burst capability. So I think standard, if you get premium SSD, you're looking at like 500 IOPS, but you get burst capability, I think like 2,000 IOPS, something like that. So that gives you your sort of, when your users log on, they will be more busy, especially in the morning when you get that logon storm. So that sort of helps with that as well. And permissions wise, when you configure Azure Files, you get those free roles created within Azure. So make sure you set those permissions correctly. Those permissions need to be set for the users who are going to be accessing the share, and also the host as well. Again, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail of how to do that. You can Google it. There's lots of articles around that. But IOPS, as I mentioned, so steady state IOPS, you look at around 10 IOPS per user. Sign in, sign out IOPS, you're looking at about 50. So again, make sure you've got your IOPS done carefully. As with normal storage, the more space you give it, the more IOPS you get. Okay, so if you are struggling with IOPS, you can like set up Azure monitors and log analytics to look at that. But if you are struggling with it, just give a bit more space, and then you'll get the performance that you need. And also make sure your Azure file share is as close to your host as possible. Obviously, preferably in the same region, in the same VNet. You don't want your Azure file share to be like 150 milliseconds away on the other side of the world, because obviously you will get big performance problems when you try to log on. As usual, we need to do some AV exclusions. So you need to exclude these. So you can use either group policy or set it in your master image and stuff like that to get the best performance. Otherwise, you'll get usual issues like performance and blue screening and all that kind of stuff. So make sure you have them in there as well. And also note for the team stuff as well, you need to exclude the Teams sort of media stack folder and the add-in cache as well from the FSLogix profile. Just a quick note around sort of Nerdio, what we do. So if you're worried about IOPS and space, you can use auto scale. So we're the only company out there to do this at the moment. So we can do auto scaling of Azure and NetApp files. So you just set that, and basically that looks at the latency. Obviously latency, if you get high latency, you're having performance issues, so it'll detect that and it'll automatically up the space to give you more sort of IOPS, and then it'll obviously do the reverse as well once you've done that. So obviously with Azure files, you can only make one change every 24 hours to go up or down. So also it do the same thing for space as well. If you're running low on space, it'll up the amount of space, so you'll never run out of space. Because if you run out of space on Azure files and all your FSLogix files are on there, you're going to have a very bad day because the profiles won't load essentially. So configuration wise, we configure it via GPO. So we can also split the containers into two. There's a profile container and an office container. If you've got a large environment, try and split them if you can, because what you don't want is your office container, for example, filling up with space and then stopping your profile from working. That'll mean when the users log on, they won't be able to log on just because you filled up the Teams cache or something, or the SharePoint cache. So if you can, split them up into two, and that'll save you with some space problems. We also do this by Nerdio. So using obviously you do it by group policy. You need to be create OUs for all your host pools, stuff like that. Using Nerdio, we can configure it within the Nerdio console on a separate per host pool basis. So you don't have to faff about with images and group policies and stuff like that. It'll just apply the settings when the users log on to those host pools. And we can even create the Azure file share, as touched upon before. So when you configure Azure files, you need to domain join it, which is kind of a bit flicky. You need to run a few PowerShell scripts and all that kind of stuff. We do all that for you as part of Nerdio. So if you struggling with all that stuff, give me a shout and I can show you through it. You can also enable SMB multi-channel as well, which is recommended. That gives you a big performance boost, up to sort of ×4 performance as well. Okay, so profile management. So this is what you see when you log on to a desktop. So essentially what you're looking at here is on the left is the VHD file, that hard disk image. So that's held on the Azure files. And then on the right, what you're looking at is the local disk management on that host. So what you can see is disk 5 is the VHD file that has been mounted, and that is the user's profile. Okay, so every read-write that goes into the C users directory is actually written to that VHD file. When the user logs off, that will be dismounted, and then the next time the user logs onto another host, that will follow him over. Okay, so all those sort of Office configuration settings will be followed around with the user, and same with all the cache settings and all that stuff. So the performance, IOPS and everything will just be a whole lot better experience for the users when they're using the solution. Space wise, as touched upon before, it can fill up very quickly if you're not careful, if you're not managing it. So there's a PowerShell script which you can use to run called invoke FSL shrink disk. So if you're filming with white space, so essentially if I put a 15 gig file, for example, into the user's profile, it could be a temp profile that's been created as part of some dodgy process or something, that VHD file will never go back down. Okay, so you could have like a 15 gig VHD file, but you're only actually using 4 gig, right? So what we can do, we can run this script, which basically look at the disk, it'll look what's on it, and then it will delete anything which is the white space essentially. Okay, so it'll take it down from 15 gig down to 4 gig. Now, if you can think about this from a large enterprise view, if you've got like 1,000 users, you can reclaim a lot of space. Some people have reclaimed in excess of 1 terabyte, which could save you quite a bit of money and also save your users a lot of pain with coming in the morning and having a full profile. So definitely recommend that and use that as part of your sort of monthly or even quarterly strategies to make sure your environment's running correctly. SharePoint. So as again, FS Logics can manage SharePoint caches and data. So that's a policy setting which you can enable. So if you're heavy SharePoint users and if you're having the problem where you're logging onto a different host every day and every time you're having to pull down all the SharePoint stuff, FS Logics will take care of that for you and just enable that, and that'll make sure that all the SharePoint data follows you around. So again, a much better user experience. MS Teams. I know a lot of you know Teams can be a bit of a pain in the physical environment, so imagine how bad it is in a virtual environment. Luckily, Microsoft has given us a per computer install, similar to OneDrive. That makes it a lot better. So essentially, again, we need to set a register key, and then we need to run all user equals 1 and all users equal 1. Okay, that's why we excluded that Teams from the Office installation. So install that, and that will basically make sure that it installs it in per computer mode, right? So again, by default, Teams installs into user profile. We're switching this to install it into computer mode, and we'd also manage the updates as well as part of that image management. Okay. Again, using Nerdio, we can do this, and we just install it as what we call a scripted action, and that deploys it onto the actual image or the host port without having you to do stuff. It does it all for you, essentially. So limitations within Teams on Azure Virtual Desktop. Creating live events is not supported. Okay, calls or meetings don't support application sharing. Desktop sharing is supported. You can't give control or take control. Also, the resolution is limited down to 720p, and also the new meeting experience is not currently supported. Okay, so be wary of that if you're deploying it into your environment, and also make sure that you've got policy settings which are set to basically enable the microphone redirection. Also play sounds on local computer and also redirect the camera, otherwise the users won't see the camera within the actual sort of Azure Virtual Desktop session host. And also coming soon, the moment sort of gallery view, you can only see 4x4. So if you've got like lots of people in a meeting, you can only see 4x4 of them. Microsoft are releasing 7x7, so that's coming soon within June. So hopefully within the next 2 weeks, we'll see that as well. So that'll be a bit better experience using Teams on Azure Virtual Desktop. Again, we're running a bit of time, so it basically uses the WebRTC protocol. And that enables you to essentially offload all the audio and video onto your local host. So the actual video host itself doesn't have to process it, and that gives you a lot better performance. So I'll show you how that works. So essentially, this is an optimized Teams client I've deployed. So if you go to version, you'll see it says WVD Media Optimized. Okay, so that's what you get when you install in the all users mode. So it's an optimized version. And then if we go into the settings and have a look at the camera. So previously you would have seen camera saying redirected. Here it's directly accessing the hardware on my camera. Okay, so it's not redirecting it, it's accessing it directly through the hardware. And if you look at the performance as well of the team, so previously, if you didn't use it on a Teams, you'd be looking at anywhere between 25 to 50% usage on the GPUs when you're deploying Teams. So using this method, you can essentially take CPU usage right down, which means more people onto your host pools, which also means a lot lower cost and better performance. So that's why we set this as it is. And also graphics. So let's touch on graphics. So over time, the graphical experience on Windows and also Office has become more and more and more. Obviously, it's using the GPU more. If you don't believe me, just have a look at your task manager and see what is using the GPU. Teams, Office, Outlook, Word all use GPU because of the graphical capability. Again, VDI environments, this isn't good. So it's preferable, if you can do, to deploy VDI onto a host which has a GPU, because that means all those graphical functions will essentially be offloaded onto the GPU. Okay, so if you look at the cost difference between a AMD GPU and a non-enabled GPU desktop, it's not that much. So here we've done a direct comparison, 20 quid a month, that's it. So obviously GPUs, there's a lot more to that. I'm just touched upon it slightly, but you can get a GPU enabled desktop for not that much money, and that cost, by the way, is only based on like 200 hours, so 50 hours a week. Again, they're just the different options. I'll fly through these, but tip also, if you deploy GPUs, make sure you set these policy settings. If you don't set them, then your environment will not actually use that GPU, and therefore it's pointless having it. So make sure you use those settings as well. So what does it look like without GPU? So here I can see I'm running, watching the England football match, and we're running around 60 to 70% CPU usage, and some dropped down to 50. So if you imagine if I've got two people on this host pool both doing it, it's not going to be a great experience, because that CPU is basically going at 100%. Okay, because what essentially is happening now is the CPU is compensating for the GPU to render those graphics. Okay, so we don't want that. So some people might use their desktop to watch YouTube. A lot of people do. People don't realize the impact that they're having. I've seen it happen many, many times. So let's have a look at the experience with a GPU. So here we've got exactly the same video, and as you can see, the CPU has dropped right now down back to below 20%. Okay, so that's nearly 70% compared to 20%, right? So I could probably fit an extra 3 or 4 people onto this host with using a GPU. Okay, that's the difference that it makes, and that's an extra 20 quid a month. So that's why, especially to get a better Office experience, you should pick a GPU if you can, because especially if, I don't know if you guys have seen it, but Windows 11 looks very, very, very graphics heavy, especially all the fancy icons and stuff. So it's going to be the future, I'd say, using GPUs on VDI desktops. Again, big shout out to Nerdio. So we do this automatically, and when we deploy our desktops, we detect whether the GPU is on the VM, and then we essentially just automatically install the drivers and set all the settings. Okay, so where are we now at the moment? So we've got our host pool, and we've installed Office onto our host pool, using all the optimizations. We're doing things rightly. We've installed Microsoft Teams onto the host pool. We've got all the Teams optimization, that's all working fine. We've got OneDrive working fine. We've got OneDrive connecting to our work environment only, and we're not syncing files, so we're saving files on the storage space. So everything is looking good. And we're auto scaling stuff, so we're constantly sort of rebuilding host pools, removing them, adding them, that kind of stuff. And it can become a bit of a problem because you could be not compliant. So, for example, someone makes an update to the image or something, or makes a change to the operating system, and you've got a lot of hosts which are constantly being rebuilt. How are we going to control all that? How are we going to report on that? How are we going to track on that when we've got hosts that have been automatically rebuilt as part of the scaling process? So Microsoft Endpoint Manager, obviously, in May 2021, and just a few weeks ago, Microsoft announced that they were doing support for Microsoft Endpoint Manager on Windows 10 multi-session. Previously, they supported the single session, obviously, but they didn't support the Windows 10 multi-session. That has now changed, although there are a few caveats which we need to think about, but it's really good because when you speak to a lot of environments, they will struggle a bit because we're getting the sort of VDI desktop being managed by this guy over here, then we get the physical desktop managed by this guy over here, then we've got the contractor desktops managed by this guy over here, and there's no sort of central way of managing everything. With Microsoft Endpoint Manager, we can take all that stuff away because we can set policies and compliance settings and defender settings and conditional access and all that stuff, which makes managing all that stuff centrally. Okay, even though we've got one person here deploying the image and we've got another person here deploying the VDI image and we've got another person here deploying the physical image, if we can bring all that together, we can essentially have all the compliance settings set automatically, right? So we don't have to worry about that stuff anymore. So what are the caveats? It only supports device configurations, okay? Nothing to do with user policies are allowed. So it's purely on a per device basis, because obviously we've got multiple people logging onto the host pool. So we don't want sort of one user policy setting something which is going to stop something working for another person, okay? So only policies which are defined in the OS scope and application scope are configured in the installing system context, right? So we can't install applications on a per user basis. It has to be set in the system context and set on the device, okay? And the same applies to when you're targeting stuff. You need to target them at devices or device groups, right? So best practice is to basically create a device group which has an automatic filter which automatically adds in all the Windows 10 multi-session hosts. So that way you're going to be compliant all the time. As I mentioned before, user scope policies are not supported. But that's currently in public preview, by the way. It's not in full release yet, so don't go deploying it into your environment unless you're happy to accept the fact that it's in public preview and you won't get the support. So what are the prereqs to get it up and working? You need Windows 10 multi-session 1903 or later. So if you're running an older version, make sure you upgrade to Windows 93 or later, preferably the very, very latest version because that will contain all the latest features. And also you need to have hybrid Azure AD join configure. So if you are using Azure AD Sync, then you need to go in there, configure Azure AD Sync to basically sync to and change the settings where it's configured with hybrid Azure AD join. I'm sure most of you are as well, especially if you're using the likes of Intune in your physical environment. But for those who want in a sort of virtual environment, this needs to be done, otherwise it ain't going to work. To check the status, just log on to a host pool or host and just check the dsreg-cmd/status. If you see Azure AD join equals yes, that means it's all configured correctly, and obviously it will be domain joined as well. Be interesting to see when we get the Azure AD and what's going to happen to this, but I guess it'll become even easier. We also need to set the policy setting to enable automatic MDM enrollment. So make sure that's set to device credential. Okay, user credential not supported. Make sure it's device credential. You don't have to put in the MDM application ID unless you've got multiple identities. But if you've got a single one, just get away with just putting that one, and that works fine. I've tested it, and it all works good. And if that's all working correctly, if you go into devices, you'll see device model equals virtual machine, and it'll come up and it'll basically say it's everything's working fine. Again, I have tested it. I didn't get time to add in the slides, but it does all work perfectly well. I've deployed a few policies to it, a few sort of defender policies, and yeah, it's all working good. And that brings me to the end of my presentation. I hope you guys found it useful. And if you've got any sort of questions, feel free to pop them in the chat window. I think we've got a few minutes left where we can answer them.
That's great, Neil. Thanks very much.
No worries. Shall I stop presenting, or are you going to take over?
No, that's okay. Yeah, just in case if we've got a couple of questions, we may get a few more, and in case if you do need to go back and forth, then I think that's fine. You can keep your screen on. But yeah, I just want to say, thanks. I learned lots from this session, and it's one of those things, which kind of falls a clear divide, isn't it, between application professionals versus the infrastructure, right? And it's kind of working with Teams, SharePoint myself. Usually, the device side of things is is probably like that's an infrastructure thing, right?
Yeah, definitely. I see it all the time, and it is a problem, especially I see it as well with sort of the Azure Virtual Desktop. Who manages it? Is it the Azure team, or is it like
Yeah.
is your team, or is it the desktop team, or is it the M365 team? It's all kind of mixing into one.
That's right. And I think every organization is unique in terms of how they divide their roles and their responsibilities. And Microsoft 365 is typically still in some ways viewed as a software, that it's a Microsoft 365. Well, then that includes Windows 10 devices, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So no, that could probably continue more. But yeah, no, I think I'll probably just get straight to the questions. So if I may.
Yep.
So yeah, we got first question, which is around users considering the VM for users in their environment, and requirements are basic around having to deploy Office apps, Adobe, and so forth. Looking at 90% of VM usage is for Outlook and Word, and this is probably $1 million question, right? Can you estimate a monthly cost per user for such a?
Yeah, so depends on many factors, obviously, but I'd say as your compute cost, I mean, if you're doing multi-session, you're probably looking at around £50 a month, I'd say. If you did and that's for a shared session. If you were deploy a VM, as you saw previously, probably your GPU desktop, you're probably looking around, I don't know, £100 a month for a one-to-one VM, I'd say.
Right. Okay. All right. No, that's indicative. That's good. So hopefully that answers the question for our anonymous user. We have a next question from somebody, Michael. Does FS Logics manage the removal of redundant profiles for users that's no longer exist in the Azure Active Directory?
No, it doesn't. So FS Logics is just an agent which sits on the local VM itself. Okay, so it doesn't look at Azure Active Directory. So it's just a local VM.
So I guess presumably, just kind of extending that further. So would that be based on the group filters for when the user left the organization?
Yeah, I mean, there's two ways you can do it. So within FS Logic, you can actually, there's an include and exclude as well. So you can, if you wanted to exclude certain users from the profile, there's a local group which it creates on the desktops, an exclude group, so you can add people in there. And also, if you want to force people to install, if you want to force people to use it as well, there's include groups as well.
Right. Okay, that's good to know. And then we got just one more question, which is there a difference in cost if a user is accessing via standard HD versus 4K resolution?
No, it's the same.
Okay, nice and easy. Okay, well, that's great. I think that's pretty much all the questions. I'm sure there will probably be a lot more questions even after the session. Our attendees may get the thoughts, so I'm sure they'll reach out to you or just use the handle M365 UK on Twitter. Feel free to get to Neil. But I think just looking at the time, I think we're perfectly on time. So once again, thanks very much for being here with us. I know, just like yourself, cost a lot of time and effort to put these kind of presentations together. So really appreciate that. And so yeah, with that, hopefully after the pandemic and so forth, would love to meet you in person. But until then, take care, stay well.
All right.
Okay, so yeah, we'll take a 10-minute break. Welcome back, everyone. Hopefully you enjoyed our first session with Neil McLoughlin, and we're good to go with our next session with Anoop Tatti. And so this session has been recorded and the slides will be shared. So for those of you who did miss session earlier, then you will be able to catch that up. But yeah, it gives me a great pleasure to welcome Anoop Tatti for his session, which is going to kick off now, which will be around exploring various options for obtaining an access token in order to work with Microsoft Graph. So we'll be looking at in the app registration, some of the ways to connect securely. And so Anoop has been around as a SharePoint developer with various companies and consultants. He's working currently at Content Cloud. And so he's been around for about, I think nearly 12, 13 years as a pure SharePoint developer. And we've often kind of bumped into various conferences and contributes to community as well. And you can find his blog at medium.com at Anoop Tatti. So without further ado, gives me great pleasure. So Anoop, thanks for being with us at M365 UK, and over to you.
All right, thank you very much, Chirag, for that. Let me just start by sharing the screen.
Mm-hmm.
Right, so hopefully you're able to see my screen.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, good.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much once again, Chirag, and welcome everyone to this session, which is on options for obtaining an access token for Microsoft Graph in Azure applications. Sorry for the long title. Right. So what I've done is I've divided this session into 3 parts. In the first part, we'll be looking at some slides around this topic, and then in the second part it'll be a demo and I'll be walking through some of the code as well, and then in the final part will be Q&A, and make sure that you ask simple questions, because if you ask difficult questions, then the Euro is on, Wales are playing, so I need to go and watch that. Okay, right, so boring slide. Just about myself. My name is Anoop Tatti. I'm a SharePoint developer at Content and Cloud. So I write some blogs related to SharePoint and Power Platform and a bit of Azure as well on the platform Medium, and that's the link to my blog, anooptatti.medium.com. And I'm on Twitter as well under the handle Anoop Tells, and I have some repositories on GitHub as well under the username Anoop T. Right. So Microsoft Graph. Now, I assume we all know what Microsoft Graph is, and I've taken this particular sentence from docs.microsoft.com. So Microsoft Graph, is the gateway to data and intelligence in Microsoft 365. It provides us a single programmability model that can be used to access a lot of data from Microsoft 365. So the Microsoft Graph team, they have given us this API, which is very helpful for us to use in various applications. And that API, it keeps on growing and growing every day. With that API, we can access a lot of Microsoft 365 data, and it is being maintained very well by Microsoft, and new things or new endpoints keep getting added very frequently. So, if you just search for Microsoft Graph, then you will get a lot of information on that. Now, the reason why I mentioned about Microsoft Graph is, we want to access data, the Microsoft 365 data, using Microsoft Graph, and that's what this session focuses on. So, this is just some of the Office 365 or Microsoft 365 services, for example, Teams or Groups or SharePoint, and then the 3 dots at the bottom. That means a lot of data. So I think it's injustice, but I've just put 3 dots. So what Graph does is, with the help of Graph, we can access all the data that is present in Teams. For example, say the channels present under a team, or some information related to any team, etc. And then we can also access group related information as well. We can access information from SharePoint, say for example some list items, or site related information. So with the help of Graph, we can access this kind of data. So this is just small amount of data. I just I put it in the slide, but like basically all this kind of Microsoft data can be accessed with the help of Microsoft Graph. Now, how do we access these? So let's say, as I pointed out on the left side over here, it can be via a web application, which is nothing but, web application developed with some front-end frameworks, say like React or Angular, or it can be through some of these these Azure app services, say for example, a web API in Azure, or maybe functions in Azure. So, with these kind of applications, we can, call Microsoft Graph and access data. So these applications call Microsoft Graph directly with the URL, which is https graph.microsoft.com. Then Graph will say, okay, Mr. Application, you do not have permissions to access data, or it'll say, basically, if you call Graph directly, then Graph won't allow the application to access data. So it says, you can. So basically, Microsoft Graph will say, okay, application, yes, you can call me, but you need to have certain permissions to do that. And in the request that you sent me, I do not see any permissions, so you cannot call me directly. Because Microsoft Graph is a protected API. It's that's the reason we cannot call it directly. So then the missing information, the permissions, how do we get that? So if I just go into the next slide, what will happen? What we need to do is we need to create something called as an application registration. So basically, the point is, with the help of these application registrations, our front-end web application or our Azure web API or the Azure function, it can use the details of this app registration and then call Microsoft Graph. So basically, just to take a step back, what will happen is when we create an app registration in Azure, we can then tell that this app registration will have certain permissions related to Microsoft Graph. So basically, maybe as an administrator of Azure, I can tell that, okay, this app registration can read groups with the help of Microsoft Graph, or this application registration can read and write to SharePoint sites with the help of Microsoft Graph. So basically, we are giving some permissions to this app registration, and then what happens is our applications, which are the say the Azure ones or the front end application, the web application. So these then communicate with this app registration, get an access token, and then they can call the Microsoft Graph. So earlier we saw that the application tried to call Microsoft Graph directly, and that didn't work. However, instead of calling the Microsoft Graph directly, the applications use the help of app registration to get an access token, and then they'll call Microsoft Graph. And then Microsoft Graph sees that the request has an access token, and it'll be happy with that, and then provides the required Office 365 Microsoft 365 data. So basically, what happens is these applications, which is so the Azure applications or our front-end application, before calling Microsoft Graph, they need to run some kind of code in order to get an access token. And once they get this access token, they can then call Microsoft Graph. So that code, which needs to be run before calling Microsoft Graph, is nothing but the code to get an access token. And in this presentation, we will see what are the different options that we have in order to get run that code or get an access token. Right, so if I just move on to next slide, rearrange things slightly. So we have a couple of new bits introduced here, which is the Azure AD on the left side. So what happens is, sorry, just to take one step back. Sorry. So in this session, what we are doing is we are only focusing on Azure applications, which is Web API or Azure function. We won't be dealing with the web application, which is the front end applications. So that's the way in which the front end applications, I call them front end applications, but web applications, the way in which they get the access token is slightly different to the way in which we can get an access token when using Azure Web API or Azure Functions. So the scope of this presentation is for Azure for Web API or Azure Functions. Right. So with that in mind, let's put our focus only on those. So what happens is, before calling Microsoft Graph, I said that there needs to be some code that needs to run to get an access token. So our application in Azure, what it does is it uses the client ID, the client secret, and scopes of this particular app registration. So our application uses the ID, the secret, and the scope of this app registration, and then sends that to Azure AD. So after that, what happens is Azure AD does some checks. So those checks, there are a lot of checks that are done in the background. We don't want to focus on what those checks are, but if Azure AD is happy with the details that were sent to it, then it responds to the application with an access token. And then what happens is our application then takes that access token and calls Microsoft Graph. So Microsoft Graph then inspects this access token and then provides us the required data if the information in the token is correct. So yeah, so coming back to this point again. So here, the way in which we get the access token from Azure AD, there are a few options. Sorry, there are a few options in which we can get this access token, and that's what this session will focus on. And so if I move on to the next slide. Right, so those again, coming back to the options in which we can get the access token. So like I said in the previous slide, our application sends some details to Azure AD. Azure AD does some computation and gives us the access token. Now, Microsoft have done all the hard work of making sure that the request is sent to Azure AD, and Azure AD does the computation and gives us the access token. So there's no need to worry about all of that because Microsoft have taken care of that. The way they have done that is using these 4 libraries that we are about to see. So the first library is called ADAL, or Active Directory Authentication Library. It is deprecated, and I just want to mention it because it in the past this was used quite a lot. So it is now deprecated, and the support for that will end next year. And then there's another library called as MSAL, which is Microsoft Authentication Library. And then the third library is App Authentication Library, which is being used currently. However, Microsoft Microsoft are saying that we should use Azure.Identity, which is the next one, instead of App Authentication Library. So basically these libraries, which are built by Microsoft, we can use these libraries in our code in order to get an access token. So there's no need for us there's no need for us to worry about how to send the request to Azure AD, what the Azure AD will do, whether the token coming back, whether it has all the information or not. So all that will be taken care by these helpful libraries which are created by Microsoft. And what we'll do is we'll go through each of these libraries, or the way in which we can get an access token with each of these libraries in our demo. Demo, let me just do a quick setup of what the demo will be, and then we will jump on to my developer Azure tenant and go through these elements. So firstly, we have an app registration, which I'll be showing to you soon. And that app registration has got groups.readAll permission. Secondly, we have an Azure function which uses Microsoft Graph in order to get all the groups present in the tenant. In this case, it will just show the display names of the groups. And then that function app has 4 functions. So each function is for a library. So first function gets groups using ADAL, second function gets group using MSAL, and the third one with app authentication library, and the last one with Azure.identity. So we'll be having a look at the function app as well. And then in order to call this function app, we'll be using a tool called as Postman. The other way of calling this Azure function is through some kind of maybe a nice front end, but that's not related to this session. But we'll be using Postman in order to call this Azure function, and we will see we will inspect the logs of this Azure function app to see the access token. Basically, the code in the function app outputs the access token in the logs. So we will grab that access token and we'll use a website called jwt.ms to inspect what's there in that access token. Right. So this is what the demo focuses on, and I wanted to mention one more point over here. So all the flow or the authentication flow that we are using here is called the client credentials authentication flow, because the apps that we are focusing on are the ones that run independently. So the Azure function that I'm going to show you might be say which runs every hour, and it gets all the groups and then maybe populates them, say somewhere, maybe to SharePoint. That's a really bad example, but you can imagine some scenarios. So that's why these are called as daemon apps, and these are the ones which have the capability to run on themselves without any user interaction. And those kind of apps use something called as the client credentials authentication flow to get an access token. There are other authentication flows as well, which will be used by different types of apps. So earlier I was mentioning about the web application, the front-end web application that uses might use a different flow. All that information is available in docs.microsoft.com under the identity section, but we will be focusing on one such flow, which is the client credentials flow. Right. Let me just open my dev tenant. So I've gone into my dev tenant in the Azure portal, and let me go into the Azure Active Directory and then app registrations and search for M365 UK. So that's the app registration which I've created. And this app registration, if I just go into API permissions, we can see that it has got group.readAll permission, which is exposed by the Microsoft Graph API. So basically, with this, this app registration, will have the capability to communicate with Microsoft Graph and read all the groups. It won't have any other permissions on Graph. Say if you want to use this app registration in order to say read or write to sites, then that won't be possible because we haven't given that permission. It'll be only able to read information related to groups. So that's our app registration. And next we have the so if I just go to the home page, we have the function app itself. So this function app, if I click on functions, you can see that it has got four functions. So firstly, the first function is get groups using ADAL, and the next one is using MSAL, and then we have the app authentication library and then the Azure identity. So we will be looking at these functions one by one. So as per the name, each function gets the group using the different libraries provided by Microsoft. Okay. Now, what I'll do is I'll call the get groups using ADAL function using Postman, and we'll see the output, and then we will delve into how this the code of this function. Right. So if I open Postman, so what I've done here is I'm created a GET request, and basically I have put the URL of that function, as you can see over here, which is get groups using ADA. And then if I hit send, what will happen is it will communicate with a Microsoft Graph using the app registration that we just saw earlier, and gives me the display names of all the groups in my tenant. As you can see, we've got some nice group names like new site 2 or DL test, because this is a developer tenant. So yeah, excuse the names. Right, so that's what this function does basically. It goes ahead and gets all the groups using the ADAL library. Now, if I quickly show you the code again, this library is deprecated and not recommended, but this is just an option. That's why I wanted to show you. So we basically do not use this library. But sorry for showing this. Right, so in the function app, so I've just opened the code of the function app in Visual Studio Code. So we have a function called as get groups, and what that does is if you just see over here, so if I just zoom in, and then so basically this endpoint, so graph.microsoft.com, and then the groups endpoint, and then we select the display name. So that's the endpoint we are hitting. And to that, we need to pass the access token. So this function gets an access token and then hits the endpoint and then just returns all the values. Now, how do we pass the access token? So as you can see at the top, we have got all the 4 functions. So firstly, let me expand the ADAL one. So what we do is we have an auth provider, which we'll be seeing soon, and that has a method called get access token, which we then pass to the groups. So if we look at the ADAL helper, so we've got the get access token method here. So this auth provider has an object of the type authentication context, which comes from this library, which is the ADAL library. And as I showed in one of the slides, we use this library. We use this particular context and call a method in it called as acquire token async. So Microsoft have just given us this one method, which or rather given us one of these methods to which we need to pass the client ID and the secret, which is the client credential, and then the scope, which is nothing but graph.microsoft.com. And then once we pass these details to this method, we just get the access token. So no need to write a lot of lines of code, just one simple line, and then we get the access token using ADAL. So that's how we get the access token. And then once we get the access token, if I switch back to the get groups method again, we just pass it to this method and call the graph API. Right, so that was ADAL. Now let's look at MSAL. So again, the same thing. We have the MSAL auth provider, and we have a get access token method, and then we pass that to the get groups method or get groups function. And here, if I open the MSAL auth, what we have done here is firstly, we have included the library, which is that one, Microsoft.identity.client, and then we create a confidential client application object called as MSAL client. Now there is a lot of there are a lot of resources available on MSAL client in docs.microsoft.com. There are a lot of videos provided by Microsoft themselves on how to use this. So I won't go into much details of it. We will just look at this particular one, which is the confidential client application. So we use the again, the helper methods provided by Microsoft. So we use the app ID, the app secret, and then build the client. And then all we have to do is for that MSAL client, there is again a method called as acquire token for client. So again, Microsoft have given us this method, which is build the client with the ID and the secret, and then call this method acquire token for client, and then it gives us the access token, and then we use that access token in order to get the details from Graph. Now let's do one thing. Let's go ahead and see what this access token contains and how Microsoft Graph is able to see that this access token is the right one. Okay, so if I just go into the function app, and then what I'll do is I'll go ahead and click on log stream. So like I said earlier, we are logging the access token when we execute the function. So let's give it a minute for it to load. And whilst that happens, let me just bring it onto the right side. And then on the left side, I'll just open Postman and pin it over here. And then we have got this MSAL function, which is nothing but get groups using MSAL. So as soon as I hit send, it should start outputting logs over here. And as you can see, it has said that we are using MSAL and then we are getting an access token. And this is the access token that we got. So if I just copy that access token and then go to the site jwt.ms and if we paste that, so first thing we notice is the audience for this is graph.microsoft.com because we want to get an access token for graph.microsoft.com resource. And then over here, there's the app display name. So basically we are using the app registration that we showed earlier in order to get an access token. And in the roles, you can see that there's group.read.all. So this is the permission that we specified in the app registration, and that's what is present in the access token as well. So when we send this access token to Microsoft Graph has code which will interpret this access token, and it sees that there is the group.read.all permission, so it is all good. So Graph will go ahead and give us all the groups. So that's what is happening over here. So this, when we inspect the access token, we will come to know all these details. Yeah, and as you can see on the left side, the function has executed and given us all the names of the groups, similar to the previous one. Right, so that's the MSAL option, which is the one which we have to use instead of ADAL. So Microsoft have a lot of articles on how to migrate from ADAL to MSAL, and there's a lot of valuable information there. If you are using ADAL, you have to migrate to MSAL because the support for ADAL is ending soon. Right, so those were the two options, ADAL and MSAL. Now, next option is the app authentication library. For this one, we just need to take a step back and think why we need to use this library, because we already have the MSAL library, doing the with MSAL library, we are already able to achieve the requirement, but how can we achieve the same requirement with the app authentication library? So what I'll do is if I just again maximize this and go to my function app. So in our code, we are maintaining a client ID and client secret, although we can use client certificate, which is a more secure option. But in this demo, we are just using a client secret. But just imagine that, if what happens is, if this app registration gets deleted or if the client secret expires, then we would have to go ahead and regenerate, recreate the app, or maybe regenerate the client secret and then take that client secret, put it in the app settings somewhere or in a key vault. So there's all this hassle of maintaining the app registration. So what Microsoft have done is they have come up with something called as managed identities. So so instead of the function app using the identity of the app registration and using that to call Microsoft Graph, the function app can have its own identity, which is called as the managed identity, and it can use that identity to call Microsoft Graph. So in the function app, if I click on identity, we can see that it's just a case of turning it on and then wait for a few seconds, and then the managed identity will be enabled for this function app. So there are a few resources on which managed identity can be enabled, and Azure Function Apps is one of those. So over here we have enabled managed identity, and this managed identity now needs permissions to talk to Graph. So how do we do that? So what happens is if I just go into a new tab over here, so what I've done here is I've gone into enterprise applications and then selected the managed identity. So basically, sorry for switching back again. So this is the function app, which is called M365 UK demo. And when we create an identity, managed identity, it will have the same name. And what I've done here is I've gone to Home, Enterprise Applications, and opened that particular managed identity. And to this managed identity, we have given the group.read all permission. So if we just see, got the Microsoft Graph, and then we've given group.read all permission. So there are a couple of ways of doing this. Unfortunately, this cannot be done through the UI. We can use either Azure PowerShell or Microsoft 365 CLI. In order to provide these permissions, it's just like running one line of code, and then you provide what permissions are needed for this managed identity, and run that script, and it provides the permissions. So now that we have established a managed identity and given the permissions for that identity to read data from Microsoft Graph, there's no need for us to use the app registration. We can just use this managed identity. In the background, what happens is Microsoft themselves maintain the ID and secret of this, and then they keep getting refreshed quite frequently. So there's no need of maintaining the secrets, or no fear of let's say if we have put the secret somewhere and then that got leaked or something like that. So there's no need to worry about that at all. Microsoft refresh the credentials of this managed identity quite frequently, and which is hassle-free. So now we can make use of this managed identity in our function app to get the data. Sorry, let's see how we do that. All right, so if I open the function app again, so we have the get groups method, and we have the Azure app, app authentication library. Again, we just create an auth provider and then call the get access token method. By the way, all this code is on GitHub. I'll be sharing the link for that at the end of the slides. And then if I now go into this app authentication library, so here what we have done, the first thing is we have imported this library, or we have referenced this library called the services.app authentication, and then this library has a class called as Azure Service Token Provider. So as the name says, we can use this provider to get the token. So ignore the part on line 23 that is used only when we are debugging the app, i.e. when we are running from our machine locally. So what happens is when this is running in Azure, this part of the code runs, and then we just create a new instance of the Azure token provider and then pass a string called as run as app. By this, we are saying that we need to use the managed identity to get the token, and then we create that provider, and all we do is again a method that is provided by Microsoft, which is called as get access token async. So we pass just the resource or the scope, which is just graph.microsoft.com, and there's no need to pass any credentials because this library automatically uses the credentials of the managed identity and gives us the access token. So again, if I go to Postman and maximize that, and then we have this function which is get groups using app auth library, and if I just run that, it goes ahead and gets all the groups. So that is how we get using app authentication library. Now Microsoft are saying if you develop new applications or new function apps or new web APIs, they are not recommending us to use app auth library. Instead, we have to use the new library which is called as Azure.identity. Now, if we quickly look at the code of that, so here we are using this Azure.identity library, and here we create a credential object and then just which will be a new managed identity credential, and then we'll use that credential. Again, you can see there's no ID or secret. Just ignore the one at the top. Again, that is just for debug mode, which won't happen when the app is in Azure. So we just use the managed identity credential. This will automatically take the credentials of the managed identity, and we call the get token async method on that credential object by passing in the scope as graph.microsoft.com/default, and then we get the access token. So let's again check how this works. So if I bring Postman over here and then click on that, and then bring this to the left side, and then open my Azure function app, and then click on the logs, and then ping that to the right side. And then if we go ahead and send this request, now you can see that we are using Azure.identity, and then we get the access token, which is outputted in the logs. And then if we take that access token and put that in JWT to inspect that, so you can see similar things now. So we are requesting an access token for graph.microsoft.com using the app display name, using the managed identity, which is M365 UK demo. So that's the name of the managed identity. And then we have the roles as group.read.all. So Microsoft Graph, when it gets the access token, it knows that this particular function is requesting, has the permissions to read all the groups, and hence Microsoft Graph returns all the groups. And if you see in Postman, that's what we are seeing here. So all the display names of the groups. Right. So just to go back to the slides again. So just to summarize, we saw how we used 4 libraries, which is ADAL, MSAL, App Authentication Library, and Azure.identity in order to get an access token with which we could call Microsoft Graph. And it is recommended to use MSAL or Azure.identity in order to get the access tokens, and not the other 2 libraries, because ADAL is deprecated and the support for that ends soon. So if you have any ADAL applications using ADAL, please migrate them to MSAL. And then we have the App Authentication Library, but for new applications, Microsoft recommend using Azure.identity. And all the function app, the code that we saw here was using the client credentials authentication flow and not any other flows, because that's the one which is relevant over here. So we saw the demo, and then here I've included some of the resources. So all the code that I showed to you is present in my GitHub repository, and that's linked to that. And what I've done is I've also written a blog post on a similar concept. So instead of calling Microsoft Graph from our application, we can call our own custom application. So the way in which we can get an access token to call our custom app is being explained in this link. And then I've also added a link which explains the client credentials flow. So Microsoft have given a lot of details on how that particular flow works and what is involved, etc. Right, so I guess that is it from my side, Chirag. I'm happy to take any simple questions, like I said earlier.
That's great, Anoop. Thanks very much. That was a good session. I mean, certainly from my side of things, that's a real deep dive, right? But no, I think I was going to say before we head for the questions, thanks for your time and effort for being at M365 UK, and always great to learn from you and all the sessions that we do here as well, and especially such a growing area for all the things that we do. So. Yeah, I'll just kind of give a couple of minutes for the folks to kind of put in their questions. I think we did have a couple though, so I'll kind of read them out.
Okay.
So let me have a look. So we got, where is it gone? Yeah, so we got a question from Andrew McLoughlin, who's one of our regular M365 UK attendee. How do we protect access to Graph to audit to keep it secure when setting up the token?
Sorry, say that again. I
yeah, sure. Yeah, so the first part of the question is more around how do we protect the access to Graph to audit, keep it secure. So from an audit perspective, when setting up the token.
Okay, so Microsoft Graph itself is a protected API, so that's why we need an access token to call Microsoft Graph. But the application which calls Microsoft Graph, we can protect them as well. So in this case, we were calling the Azure function, and that was not protected. But there are some options to protect the function app itself. So. Again, it is a capability provided by Microsoft, and I'll put some links in the chat related to that. And in fact, I saw earlier that next month, Joel Rodriguez is presenting a session. So in that, there'll be some information on protecting the function app.
Yeah. Okay, no, that's great. Thanks for that. And then we have another question. In fact, this question came a bit earlier from Matt Whiteley, and it's more about in terms of some of the methods for limiting access to whitelisted IP ranges for access to the application. Do you have any thoughts around that, or some of the ways you can configure that easily? Or
right, I do not have much information on that, but maybe yeah, I need to dig a bit more on that, because I'm not I haven't worked with limiting IP ranges in the past.
Right.
But one of the options may be the access token that comes. Say if we have a custom API, we get the access token and we have the ability to inspect that access token. So maybe if there is some information related to IP address in that access token, we can try and that.
I guess what I'm thinking, and if I could maybe read between the lines here, is I guess it's more like, let's say if you've got an insurance industry, an application that's connecting to very like SharePoint, for example, to be able to retrieve some of the files, files or whatever you call it, bespoke application deployed using the application or application-based authentication. Then in a way, first of all, you're going to honor whoever's got rights to read or write access to that SharePoint content, for example. But then are you able to limit that app, even though it's running through application-based authentication, to limit the IP range so that only specific devices, for example, and the users, of course, can access that application? If that kind of is more like another layer of security, I guess.
Yes, yeah. Sorry, my knowledge on that side is a bit week.
Sure. No, that's okay. That's okay. I just thought I kind of run that by because it could be, and that's more from an infrastructure perspective, isn't it? Whoever, when they look after all the app registrations and so forth. So no, that's okay. I think it's worth trying that. But I think absolutely. I think if you're able to kind of maybe. I appreciate you're going to be sharing the code on GitHub and everything else. But yeah, if you do find something on that, then please do
Sure.
let us know. And I'll just think, yeah, that's it. So we just had just a comment really to say if you come across any ideas regarding security tips, then that would be good, because I do agree some of the information on Microsoft Docs is a bit vague in terms of very quick to show how things can be done very quickly and easily, but it would be good to have that. So yeah, I think with that we'll just kind of say thanks to everybody really on this, and hopefully everyone's kind of enjoyed and learning a lot from today's session. And of course, if have a look at the Q&A, I've posted the links in there as well for the links to the YouTube and slides and things that you'll get on Friday. But until then, just like to say a big thanks once again to Neil McLoughlin and Anoop for being here today, and hopefully you take care of yourselves, and until next time we can sort of get together. But yeah, I think for those of you who are still following us for the M365 UK, as I mentioned earlier, session coming up next month on the 14th of July. So you can register if you haven't already. And so we have Joel Rodriguez, you got Zoe Wilson, and also Luke Evans. So again, slightly extending the session further with securely connecting to SharePoint. So that will be good for the developing, but also some of the practical use cases and tips from Zoe and Luke with regards to balancing the usability versus the security around Microsoft Teams, and especially in the last few months, I think there's a lot of functionality coming out. So it's always good to kind of start off with. Looking forward to that. And again, I posted the links there. So if you do have any ideas after watching a couple of sessions today, and you want to submit your session idea or proposal, please feel free to do so on that link there. And so would love to welcome you and speak with us. So I think until then, just take care of yourself, stay well, enjoy the sunny weather we have, and yeah, see you until next time.